So we just mentioned about the parallel between Genesis and Matthew. So we are right now in Matthew 2 and 23. So in that verse, is there any parallel showing us how it looks with the physical man creation connecting with the spiritual man?
Well, as a matter of fact, Katrina, there is an incredible parallel. We've seen this last verse summary of Christ's youth, preparing him for the ministry. So let's just take a look at Genesis 2 and verse 25. And I'm just going to keep it in Strong's because we're going to look at some of the words here in the Hebrew. And it's talking about Adam and Eve. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. This verse is the last verse of the creation story. The next verse starts out, now the serpent, and it starts talking about the temptation. So this verse here in Genesis 2:25 is the last verse. It's the summary of the creation, and it's talking about the state of the man and the woman. So it says here that they were naked. And of course, we just stop at that word naked from a physical point of view. In other words, they had no clothes on. But look at H6174 here. It's the word aum from H6191. And here, the immediate translation is nude, naked, etc. But let's go and look a little deeper here. H6191. This is the primitive root, properly to be bare. Another meaning of this word here is to be cunning. Now, Strong says usually in a bad sense, but it is in a good sense also. And in this particular case, because it's the very end of creation, it's before the temptation, this cunning is a good cunning. In other words, they're using their minds properly. Now, notice it here, beware, take crafty, and counsel. Now, we use that word crafty a bit negatively, but if we consider that it can also be proper counsel, to be prudent, to be careful. And this is the description of their mentality in this particular verse at the end of creation. In other words, it's describing how they were after, who knows, probably 1 or 2 days after their creation, after the Sabbath day, because that Sabbath day is mentioned at the end of chapter 1 and also at the beginning of chapter 2. And notice this last definition here. This is a description of the mental outlook of Adam and Eve before the temptation. And they were in a totally positive outlook, as it says here, and these words don't necessarily reflect it, but they were prudent and they knew how to dealing subtly in the positive sense. They knew how to make decisions. They knew how to think. They knew how to reason properly because God had taught them on the preceding Sabbath. The point being here is that this is the state of the first man and the first woman immediately after creation. It describes their preparation for life on earth. That's what it's doing here. And the parallel is that this is the state of the first man as he begins, as I said, his life on earth. And when we look at the spiritual man, as we saw in Matthew 2:23, that is the state of Christ, who is now a man, and it is the state after his preparation. So we actually have the first man in this positive mental state, and we have the spiritual man also in a positive mental and spiritual state.
Uncover the mystery of Adam and Eve's nakedness. Unravel the ambiguous connection between the Hebrew term for naked and the serpent's subtlety. Join us for this free mini-course and gain a profound new perspective on biblical Hebrew. TheExplanation.com/naked